give you guys just a little brief introduction to pesticides. Pesticides are one of the ways that pests are managed with. And it's important that you have a working knowledge of pesticides as a master gardener. So we're going to talk a little bit about types of pesticides, toxicity and impacts, the label, less toxic pesticides, and where you can get information. So what are pesticides? They're substances that control, suppress, or repel pests, and they can be used against all kinds of pests. A lot of times when people hear the word pesticide, they think of insecticide only. Insecticides are pesticides that kill insects. However, we have other pesticides like herbicides that control weeds. That is another type of a pesticide. Rodenticides control rodents, fungicides control fungal pathogens, acaricides or miticides control mites, and molluscicides kill mollusks. So there's a whole variety of different kinds of pesticides killing different kinds of insects. One of the critical things with pesticides is to understand the selectivity. So that means, what does it kill? How broad spectrum, how broad is the range of organisms it kills, or is it narrow? So we'll have a broad spectrum pesticide. For instance, this is bifenthrin, which is a type of pyrethroid, and it kills all types of insects, a whole lot of variety of insects. So it's sort of, you don't have to think you got that there. It'll kill cockroaches, it'll kill ants, it'll kill caterpillars, it'll kill aphids, it'll kill anything. It'll kill wasps, it'll kill lady beetles, it'll kill fish. And so it's a broad spectrum insecticide, and it's a very persistent one too. But a selective pesticide kills only organisms in a related group. So a good example of that is Bacillus Thuringiensis, which is a disease of caterpillars formulated as a pesticide. So it only kills caterpillars. And so it won't kill honeybees, it won't kill fish, it won't kill lady beetles, and it won't kill aphids. It's a selective. It selects only for caterpillars. So it's good in an integrated pest management program if caterpillars are your problem, because it won't kill natural enemies. And in IPM programs, we try to choose pesticides where we can that are selective. So and usually these selective pesticides are also less toxic for people and dogs and birds and stuff. For herbicides, selectivity is also an issue. So we have some herbicides that kill grasses, but not broadleaves. So people might use those in their planting beds. Then we have other herbicides that are selective for broadleaves, but don't kill grasses. So people use those in their lawns. And then we have non-selective herbicides like glyphosate or Roundup that kills all the plants. And so when you're choosing an herbicide, it's really important that you know which plants will be affected. Because a lot of these herbicides, some of the herbicides, particularly the pre-emergence ones, will persist in the soil for quite a while, and so you may not be able to grow things you wanted to grow for a while. And also, if they drift over onto the plants, your desirable plants, you can have a lot injured. So be really careful with herbicides. I think they have limited, my personal feeling is they have limited uses in gardens. Most of the things you can do without herbicides, but there are some situations where you want to use them. But understand their selectivity. And the other thing about herbicides is some are post-emergent and some are pre-emergent. So pre-emergent herbicides are applied before the weed seeds germinate. So they are not effective if the weeds have already peeked their green things through, leaves through. You got to apply them because what they're doing is they're inhibiting germination. And then there's post-emergent, and these won't have any effect on the seeds. The post-emergents, those are ones you apply after the weeds have emerged from the soil. So you've got to apply them at the right time, otherwise they won't work. And then there's the issue of contact versus systemic herbicides. So many of the, so contact herbicide is one that only kills the part of the plant that it comes in contact with. So you apply it to the leaves and it kills the leaves, but if there's a good root system, it doesn't kill the roots, and what happens? You get a new plant. So most of the organic herbicides that you find, that's what they are, is they're contact herbicides. They burn the plant back. If the plants are just little seedlings, that might actually kill them. But if they have a good root system on them, the plant will be back. Then the systemic herbicides that you apply to the leaf, and it actually gets into the root, and it'll kill the plants. Although some of the very larger plants it doesn't kill. But and most of the synthetic herbicides are systemic. And we also have contact versus systemic in insecticides. Most insecticides are actually non-systemic or only limited systemic. And so you apply it on the plant and it will only kill insects that come in contact with the parts of the leaf or the plant that are treated. The systemic insecticides, and imidacloprid is a good example of that, is you apply it to the soil, it's taken up through the roots and gets into the leaves and other parts of the plant. Some of these, imidacloprid actually will remain toxic to the woolly hackberry aphid for 2 to 3 years after application. And so that's a great benefit if you're trying to keep the hackberry woolly aphid off of your trees, because it'll last for 2 years, so that's great. But it's pretty amazing to think that it's persisting in the plant material. And the hackberries don't have flowers that bees visit, so it's not so much of a concern. But other plants, I don't know how long it would persist in flower material, but it does go into the, so these are trees that lose their leaves, and then we'll get new leaves that will still be poisoning the insects. So toxicity is the ability of a pesticide to injure a living organism. And one of the basic things when we're talking about toxicology and pesticides is, everything at some dose, at some level is toxic. If you just eat straight salt, you can kill yourself. We know you can just drink too much water and you can kill yourself. And so the dose makes the poison. And so one of the things that's really important is to, when you're assessing toxicity, is know what dose is toxic. And that's usually evaluated in something called LD50, or lethal dose 50. I'm not going to talk about that here. Pesticides can move in the environment. So you think you've done a good job of applying them, but some of it always sort of blows away in the air. Some of it will run off. And particularly if there's sprinkler irrigation soon after, and as we know, it can get into our creeks and rivers that way, and oceans. So you want to read, it's really important to read the pesticide label. It's got really important information on it. One of your handouts is a mock-up of a pesticide label. There's important to know the brand identification, the active ingredients, the direction. There'll be some precautionary statements, first aid instructions, and if you do get poisoned, or somebody gets poisoned with a pesticide, bring the container with you to the doctor, so that'll help he or she get proper information. I want you to be able to distinguish between the trade name and the active ingredient. And so one of the here's one. Here's one. So the manufacturer, they're trying to sell their product, right? So what they put in big letters is "Weed Be Gone," and that's what they want you to be buying. Weed Be Gone, and that's their brand name or trade name. And in this case, we've got Concerned Garden Defense. And so they develop these names because they think they're names that consumers want to buy. But it doesn't tell you about what the toxic ingredient is in that pesticide, and that's what you need to know in order to evaluate how toxic it is. And so what you really want to know is what the active ingredient is. And the active ingredient is in tiny letters here. It's a chemical name in tiny letters. And this is another reason why you need a hand lens. Because it's very hard to see the active ingredient here. So, because the active ingredient is, if you want to look up and see the toxicity, if you want to see whether it's effective against the pest, you need to know the active ingredient. Manufacturers often, they find a good name like Weed Be Gone, and they'll actually switch the active ingredients in it. Like for instance, when diazinon went off the shelves, they kept their good bug-begone trade names, but then they just put pyrethroids in there. So you can't use those to do any to really determine things. There's signal words. The signal words give you a very gross idea of how acutely toxic these materials are. Should you take some in orally or on your skin? And so they are danger, warning, and caution. The least toxic are caution. Second least are warning. 1 teaspoon will kill you. 1 teaspoon to an ounce will kill you. Danger, it's pesticide specific, but it can just be taste to a teaspoon. So these are really toxic things. Most of the pesticides on our garden center shelves have the caution signal word. There are a few warning and also still very few danger, but most are caution. And the thing about it is, so it's nice to have these signal words, but you can see the caution is from 1 ounce to relatively non-toxic, and that's a pretty broad range. It's my kid drinks it and dies, or my kid drinks it and it doesn't matter. And so people want to know the difference there. And so this doesn't give you that kind of fine tuning, so you have to go to the LD50 of that. Also doesn't tell you anything about carcinogenicity or reproductive effects or long-term effects. But it is helpful, but it's not the final answer. The directions for use are really important. They tell you how to mix up the product, what plants or sites you can use it on. Really important to look on the pesticide label for what plants or sites can be used on. Some pesticides are only meant to be used indoors or on structures. They're not meant to be used on plants. Some pesticides can be used on ornamental plants, but should not be used on food plants because of potential problems. And with herbicides, you got to be really careful because some herbicides are going to kill your plant. And so you really need to know that. They also provide a list of pest controls, and that's helpful. But if you want to know what pesticide to use for your pests, look at the UC guide, because they are very generous with themselves about the pests they include there. And often the products, well, maybe they'll kill a few of them, but they're not really the best product for the pests. But if the pest's not on there, then unless it's a very new pest, it's not you don't want to use it. Let's see. And most of the pesticides on our garden center shelves are registered by the U.S. EPA and the California Department of Pesticide Regulation. There'll be an EPA registration number on the label when it's registered. And then in California, pesticides have to be registered by the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, which is more restrictive than the U.S. EPA. So you will find that there's pesticides for sale in Arizona that aren't for sale here. And that's because the California Department of Pesticide Regulation has, for one reason or another, determined that they are not suitable for use in California. California has stricter environmental rules. California requires efficacy data showing that the materials work, which US EPA doesn't. So sometimes you can buy these pesticides online, and you should only be using pesticides registered in California. And to complicate everything, we used to say everything has to be registered. So now there's a whole category of pesticides that are not registered by either US EPA or Cal DPR, and they're called 25B, or they're exempt materials. And these are pesticides that are made out of food products. And they're exempt from registration, and they don't have EPA numbers on them. And there's getting to be a huge number of these products on shelves, most of the EcoSmart ones, for instance. Peppermint oil, rosemary oil. So these are food-grade products, and we don't know a whole lot about the efficacy of these, although some of them do seem to have temporary knockdown efficacy for insects, mites, fungi, and they're even for weeds. So they're out there. Organically acceptable pesticides are derived from natural products, such as plants or minerals. and they haven't been chemically processed. Some have the OMRI logo on them. Some of them say organically acceptable, and some of them don't. Like most oils, petroleum oils are organically acceptable, but a lot of manufacturers don't bother putting organically acceptable on the label. Many people want to use only organically acceptable materials in their gardens, and in general, organically acceptable materials are safer. Most of them are pretty safe because they came from them, but they still have environmental impacts. And you don't want to use, some of them can actually be quite toxic. In fact, one of the few pesticides that has a danger label is actually an organic one, which is high dosage of vinegar or acetic acid. The weed farm product has a danger because it's very caustic. You do have a handout on some organically acceptable pesticides used in gardens and landscapes. So this is most of them. Take a look at them. I was talking to somebody during the break, and they were saying, well, their pest control company was applying pyrethroid, which is comes from the chrysanthemum flower, and they felt that that was safe to use on a regular basis. Well, pyrethroid has the advantage of breaking down within 24 or 48 hours, so it doesn't have long persistence, but it is a broad spectrum material that can kill bees, it can kill parasitic wasps, it can kill, if it gets into an aquatic environment, it can kill fish, and so, and cats are sensitive to it too. So just because it's organically acceptable doesn't mean that it's absolutely safe, and you need to use them with every caution. You've got to wear your gloves, you should wear your goggles, because many of these products do have impacts, like the Bacillus subtilis, which is a fungicide. They actually do say that you need to wear goggles and gloves and something over your mouth, because if you take it into your lungs, you can have some issues. So just because it's natural doesn't mean it's totally safe. And then there's this other category called less toxic pesticides. It's not an official term. It's something that we've used in the university and has been used by our water world up in Northern California. But it's sort of something where we've been trying to promote the products that have the least impact. And you have on one of your little cards, there's a least toxic insecticide used. So some of the least toxic insecticides are the oils and the soaps, including plant-based oils and BT. So soaps and oils kill all kinds of soft-bodied insects. They're not very effective against insects with hard covers like beetles or larger insects like caterpillars. Mostly they're for these sucking insects like aphids and immature scales, whiteflies, thrips, lacebugs, psyllids, spider mites. Oils are also, and some soaps, but particularly oils, are very effective against powdery mildew and a few other foliar diseases. Soaps work a little bit differently than oils, and they're used mostly for herbaceous plants. Oils are much easier to put in a compressed sprayer and spray on a large tree for dormant treatment, for instance, but they kill in similar ways. Petroleum, some people think, oh, I don't want to use a petroleum oil, but petroleum, you have to keep in mind that these are like 1% oil in water, 1 to 2% oil in water. So this, you're not doing an oil slick, you're not going to kill the eggs of birds in your trees. This is like, you put these are the same kinds of oils you're putting on, they're very highly refined, you're putting on your baby's bottom. And of course, in some cases, so they're very safe in the environment. And the plant-based oils are a little more expensive. The neem oil may have some anti-feedant and qualities to it that may make it a little bit more effective than petroleum oil, but not that much. They're more expensive. This is a list, and I'm just the list of these 25B products, the exempt kind of products, give examples of some of these food products that are in these things. They seem to have some efficacy, temporary efficacy on the soft-bodied insects, some of the same ones that you see with other oils and soaps. But they actually kill in a little bit different way than they may be having some of the smothering effect of the other oils, but they do also have some anti-feed and repellent activity in them.
Is it just the oil, or if you planted the plants among your other plants?
Oh, if you planted the plants from the oil. Okay, planting your plants, that's a really good question. This idea of companion planting, and it's really separate from this. Companion plants, they have never been shown to work. These things have to get on the body of the insect. So they're contact poisons. So and this is the same with oils and soaps. They have to get actually on the body of the insect. They don't leave toxic residues, at least not for very long. So you want to get them right on the body. And for these repellent plants, people always do this companion planting thing. So yeah, some plants repel pests, keep pests off of themselves, but it's not strong enough to keep them off the lettuce plant that's growing next door. You could plant these, you plant a more repellent plant around your lettuce plant, and it'll just outcompete the lettuce plant. It's not going to have an impact on it. Companion planting may be good for providing nutrients, but is not good for pest control. Microbial pesticides are derived from insect pathogens. Bacillus Thuringiensis, which is a disease of caterpillars, is the key, the most common one. We also have a Bacillus Thuringiensis that is Israelizensis, which is effective against mosquitoes and fungus gnats. So for the caterpillar Kostaki BT, the caterpillar has to eat it, it has to consume it, because that activates the toxin in its gut. And if the caterpillar doesn't eat it, so you have to cover the leaf surface for the caterpillar to eat it, and then that'll kill it. So a bee or bees or other non-lepidopterous things won't be affected. A butterfly flying there doesn't eat leaves, it won't be affected. The BTs are most effective against small caterpillars. These BT Israelizensis really good for mosquitoes as the mosquito ducks or mosquito bits, and as for fungus gnats and potted plants. There's another microbial, this granulosis virus for codling moth, which is a fairly new product. Fairly new product. Other lower toxicity insecticides to be aware of. These are things that you use when the soaps and the oils and the microbial don't work. So this is the next level. These have some impact on natural enemies in bees, but they aren't very persistent, so the impact is fairly short-lived. So they are compatible with IPM programs, but you need to use them carefully and selective. So one of them is spinosad. Spinosad is, it's actually, and it's organically acceptable, it's derived from a soil microorganism, but it's actually fairly broad spectrum. But it turns out that it is a good product for some of these pests that are really hard to control. One of them is the spotted wing Drosophila, which is a new pest on cherries particularly, and some other fruits. The codling moth, which is really hard to control, and it's also effective against thrips. So it's a product that is now being widely used, but it does have some really important uses. Then there's the botanical insecticides. Again, these are organically acceptable, like pyrethrum from a chrysanthemum flower and azadirachtin, which is extract from the neem tree. It's not we have neem oil, and then azadirachtin also comes from the neem tree, but it's not an oil. So they're two actually separate products that come from. And these can be useful against caterpillars and some other kinds of insects that are hard to control with oils or soap. Ant baits. But the materials you want to stay away from generally are the organophosphates. Many of these have been taken off the market for home and garden and residential use, but we still have malathion. Particularly disulfiton is actually gone now, and acephate, not too much of it, but carbaryl or 7. So these older pesticides, they're there because they kill a broad spectrum of insects. They're also very hard on honeybees, extremely hard on natural enemies. They're toxic to people too, but not as toxic as some of the really older products. Then pyrethroids, they are synthetic pesticides that mimic sort of the action of the pyrethrin from the botanical, from the chrysanthemum flower, but it's like pyrethrin on steroids. They're very persistent in the environment. The thing about pyrethrin, it's a nerve poison, and but what happens is it often doesn't quite kill the insect, and it can recover from the nerve poison. So with pyrethrin, they usually put some other synergist in there, either peppermint butoxide or oil or something to sort of work on it. But these pyrethroids, and they all end in RIN, and it's very confusing because the names seem very similar to the botanical pyrethrin. Bifenthrin, permethrin, cyfluthrin, cypermethrin, esfenvalerate, which doesn't have a thrin on it, are all pyrethroids. These are materials that are the materials that are showing up in our water, in our creeks and in our bays, and killing aquatic invertebrates. And so we're really trying to stay away with them. And they persist in the environment for a really long time. That's one reason why they're effective pesticides. You know, they're there for a long time, but since they're there for a long time, they can have long impacts. And then the neonicotinoids include the imidacloprid, dinotefuran, and a few others, the systemic materials. And I've already talked about the toxicity to natural enemies and bees of all these types of products. So this is just sort of a repeat of the same type, but you might want to take a look at it on your handout later. And again, the toxicity to bees is pretty similar to natural enemies. The organophosphates, carbamates, pyrethroids, and neonicotinoids, and pyrethrin when formulated with VPO are highly toxic to bees. The lower toxicity materials are BT soaps and most oils. But the big thing with bees is you want to protect them by never applying pesticides when plants are in bloom or when bees are visiting. And for these neonicotinoids that stick around in the plants, you'd never want to apply them before plants bloom. So if you're going to try to control the Asian citrus psyllid with imidacloprid, wait until the plants have finished blooming, and so it doesn't get into the flowers. Iron phosphate we talked about before for snails and slugs. And the herbicides used in organic systems, most of these are burn back products, non-selective, contact materials. And here's some fungicides that are, oils are really great fungicides. We have a biological, the Bacillus subtilis, which can be useful. And there's still a lot of sulfur used. These are for foliar ones. Copper is still used for some of the dormant sprays for organophosphates. So we're going to look at the toxicity information when we look at the website, but on our website you'll be able to compare risks of pesticides suggested there for water quality, natural enemies, honeybees, and people, and we'll look at that this afternoon. And these are some sources of pesticide information on the web. This National Pesticide Information Center is in Oregon is a really good place. If somebody says, I want to know about imidacloprid, and give me the facts that I can understand, or iron phosphate, or any of these things, they have really nice sheets that you can print out and give to people, or send them PDFs. They're really understandable and a good resource. Okay, so you're way past your lunch, and then after lunch, if you have time, we'll look at the labels.